round of ProAms 2021. Congratulations to all of you for making it thus far. And chair, judging with me are Anggi, Batara, Bobby, and Kario. Before we start, just make sure to sort some things out prior to your speech, like and preferred methods of POI. I will not be giving out time signals. However, I will notify you if you've passed your. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to invite the Honorable Prime Minister to start the debate.
Check. Am I audible? Check. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay. Wait, let's just open my timer. So I will start in 3, 2, 1. So I think in opening government, as this developing state, we would obviously want better economic development for the states and so on and so forth, the best for our society. So we think that we're going to argue in opening government that the raw materials that we possess and we excavate should be processed domestically into things that are readily available and the things that you can assemble. Basically not necessarily raw materials that you need to further process. It's just like you purify these nickels and also coals and so forth so that it's ready to be used to a material that is useful. But also in our side of the house, an additional mechanism is that maybe in our side of the house, there's going to be private investors who gets a share in the operation of this mine processing. So therefore the operational cost can also be covered by both the government and also private entities. So we think that makes the question of the debate whether it should be processed domestically in our side of the house or you want to export it to other countries in opposition. So first of all, in my argument, why then this creates better domestic economy for the people itself, right? So we think that in opening government, it's obvious that these nickels and also the coals and so forth, these are the products that we're going to process domestically, right? But we think that the importance for you to process this product domestically is that you need to take a look on their utility. I think the utility for the nickels and also the coals in these developing countries are particularly important because their utility not only extends to industrial utility, but also extends to an utility that is useful for the basic livelihood of the people. Like for example, nickel is used for electricity products or maybe creating household items and so forth. And also coal is used particularly for generating electricity in these developing countries, particularly when developing countries doesn't possess environmentally friendly technology to produce electricity. So we think that the importance for you to process these things domestically is that it means you're going to sell it to your own people. It means that you're going to market and also use the products, like for example, the battery of nickel and the cables of electricity and the coal, for example, is used by the people yourself. So it means that in our side of the house, it's going to be more accessible for the people itself because it doesn't come externally. When it comes domestically, it means that people are going to have easier access on that. So it means there is more internal economic activity in our side of the house because people are actively purchasing the things that is produced domestically in government side of the house. So we think that in our world it's going to be much better because the comparative on their side of the house, like these products, when they are exported, it means that there is probably less the disposable quantity of this kind of product that is essential to the people because most of the time you're going to export it to other countries. So we think that on their side of the house there's going to be things like more expensive materials that is used for the nickels and also the basic household necessity or maybe electricity is going to be slightly more expensive because of the fact that you don't have enough disposable material that you can use domestically, right? So that's the first argument. So second of all, I'm going to talk about why then this creates better job opportunity for the people. I think inside the refinery, this would add to a better job opportunity for the people in developing state because I think, yeah, it's quite intuitive that they need better jobs and so forth. We think that in the process of you purifying the nickel and transforming them to a material that can be assembled to a ready-to-use product, it means that for one, there is going to be more jobs for the people, because most of the time, the process between you excavating and also processing requires different resources. Like when you want to refine these products, you sometimes need human hands and also human labor, for example, ladies and gentlemen, because when you compare it like excavating raw material, sometimes it's going to be excavated done by heavy machinery and so forth. So there is going to be minimal human job opportunity on that side of the house for these developing countries. But second of all, in our side, there's going to be also, when it is domestical, there is going to be things like you need RD or you need marketing for these people to market the product domestically. So there is not only blue collar job opportunity, but there is also white collar. Results into a push for the government to provide educations for the people on the ground, because they're not only possible to be labor, because when you have this refinery, you have the possibility of transfer of skills from these kinds of corporations and also the government, because maybe, for example, ExxonMobil, when they invest in Indonesia for the nickels, it means that to those who are domestic. But moreover, it means that when these private investors exist in this developing country, they need to develop other branches in this developing state to accommodate further follow-up mechanism to the already processed raw material. So in our side of the house, there's going to be like better provision of basic needs like the raw material that is processed. But okay, that's the second argument. But lastly, I'm going to talk to you about the sustainability of the business model, because I think on their side of the house, what's worse is that when you have investors on their world, it's going to be seen like it's going to be expendable, because on their world, they only excavate the resources and then you export them, right? It means they're going to most likely leave you behind and like not caring for you, and they're going to withdraw their investment, for example, because you have no utility again for them. The difference in our side of the house is that when investors already invest not only to the mining and so forth, but they also invest to the factory and also the market. So when times are hard, they're not going to easily pull out and withdraw their investment, which harms this developing state, ladies and gentlemen. So this only leads to, for example, if you are the labor who mines this kind of coal and nickel, it means that when you run out of things to be mined, you're going to be left behind by these corporations because, well, yeah, you're expendable, right? The difference in our side of the house is that you have industrial knowledge, you have white collar occupations and so forth. So in our side of the house, we prevent that from happening. We're very proud to.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now, to open the case from opposition, I would like to invite the leader of opposition.
Check audible. Hello?
Yep.
Okay. First of all, I'm very happy to debate in semifinals. Glad to compete against you guys. Okay. And then I don't have any specific gender pronoun. If you guys want to POI, please do it through chat. Don't unmute yourself because I really hate to be interrupted. Wait, please wait a moment. Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. The way PM frame this debate is that this raw material exports that doesn't necessarily bring any benefit to begin with, but also doesn't necessarily reframe why in the end of the day it could actually cause such harms in the end of the day. But moreover, the the core problem coming from PM speech is that their idea of actually try to make a foreign investment do this type of machinery refinement or something. I don't know. I'm not an economic guy. Is how in the end of the day the characteristics of this foreign investment when they actually get their hands on our abundant resources of material in the end of the day. Because I think this type of resources can only be managed by our local industries. That's why I would say first, it is far better for us to actually do raw material comparatively rather than actually risking ourselves towards the foreign investment in the end of the day, right? But first of all, on the further rebuttal will be intertwined in my argumentation. But first of all, let's talk about the money, right? Because in the end of the day, the end goal of this debate is to talk about the economic development in the end of the day. This is very contingent on two things, right? Number one is on the idea of profits, but number two is the idea of transfer of knowledge. Transfer of knowledge will be later. Let's talk about number one first, right? The idea of benefit under their side of the house is very the is very questionable in the end of the day. Why? Because in the end, the profit will lead towards the investor anyway. Because most likely for us, if we actually want to get the most money and profit, is to get local investors, which is probably highly unlikely to begin with. Because the idea of resources will be the same, and the idea of benefit is still going to be the same anyway. How? Because the idea of flow of money inside of the industry of this raw material coup and so on and so forth is you as a country what is it called, proving your own materials in the end of the difference is that on their side of the house the cost of this operation might be going to be more abandoned in the end of the day, even if under the idea of foreign investor. How is that possible? Because of the cost which is we are going to deal with, right? Which is going to intertwine in my next argument why in the end of the day it is not going to be worth it. We need to understand how the refineries of this foreign investment is likely going to be. In order for this foreign investment to actually maintain profit, the ideal way for them to actually be inside of this developing country is to be a direct investment in the end of the day. Therefore, they're probably going to be an FDI in the end of the day, right? Which we believe it will create a far more harmful refineries inside of the current status quo. Why? Two layers. Number one, it is going to be more expensive because the way in this idea of expensive is on the idea of operation, which we don't want to necessarily exist, right? Because they're most likely to actually become aggressive and actually refine the materials inside our own, which needs more management in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. For example, the idea of raw materials is very contingent on the idea of working with countries which actually operate it is going to be much more significant under their side of the house. But moreover, it's also going to risk our workers and our citizens in the end of the day because they are most likely going to use labor force or workforce in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Which we say it is not okay. Why? Because number one, it is going to in the end of the day, it is going to force us to actually deal with this type of harm towards the environment, but also towards the citizen in the end of the day. And it's also, and we agree on the idea that probably that, that in our side of the house, this type of harm can also exist, but the addition of the actual chemical waste and so on and so forth, and the idea of labor development wouldn't actually exist under their side of the house, and it's just going to be very questionable. More on that later. Which means on the number two, it is clearly going to change. The way you are going to change is only going for you to actually outsource the risk and so on and so forth, which leads towards three layers of I'm sorry, two layers of explanation. Number one, why is it not suitable and strategic? because on the idea of moral attachment, right? Now, the first layer, because this idea of FDI, when they actually see an abundant amount of resources and considering they are probably going to be most profit oriented, they're most likely going to strip the business values without actually necessarily adding more in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, which leads towards the second layer about their access to local markets in the end of the day. Companies call it, they can use companies collateral investment to actually get locals, get lower costs and local loans in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, instead of investing it in the end of the day. And we say also by their aggressive approach, they can also tear down local businesses and this type of massive other raw material industries in the end of the day in order for them to actually pursue. But also on the idea of knowledge, I would say it is not going to be that good, right? On theory, it is good because yeah, because it is basically only an amount of relationship and so on and so forth. But in today's practice, I don't think it is going to be that easy, right? Because the idea of transfer of knowledge is going to be that difficult on the idea of developing countries. How is that possible? Because we say the transfer in this in the end of the day is going to be that limited. Why? Because foreign investors doesn't voluntarily pass knowledge in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Considering they are looking for investment, they are most likely going to only share this knowledge to reap the max benefits towards the suppliers and people in power in the end of the day. Therefore, the benefit is not necessarily going to be in the people who are actually needed in the end of the day. And the and developing countries cannot necessarily do that. Why? Because their power is completely outcompete, and the disappearance of this type of job can also necessarily exist, right? Because this is going to create a disadvantages for the countries trade internally, and only strong countries can actually stop that, not developing countries. Why comparatively better if we are actually going to do raw materials? It's because it is a direct type of us actually getting the money. And also on the idea of refinement, we say stand on the idea that this type of refinement is still going to create us more cost anyway. The benefit is not going to be that big of a margin. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. To extend the case from opening government, I invite BPM.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. My page. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. First, the possibility of FDI and exploitation of foreign actors like who want to talk about. Second, I'm going to explain why it's likely that we will make our own refinery project as opposed to only export-based economy. And lastly, I'm going to explain even in the best case that you could get money out of this export industry, why we have more multiplier effect in the capital distribution in our side of the house. So first, let's talk about FDI, because what they talk about is when we do this refinery investment project, we're going to rely to the foreign direct investment. First of all, I think in most of developing countries that they don't have enough state-owned enterprises that have the capacity to build their own export-based industry anyway. Like a lot of industries like nickel, cobalt, or other chemical things, the process of excavation, the process of mining into the earth to get this particular kind of chemical and raw materials sometimes still rely on the foreign direct investment. So the harm is symmetrical in both sides of the house. But second of all, it's not like in our side of the house, we cannot pick and choose which kind of private corporations that we can negotiate and will give us the best term and condition, the best leverage position as a state, especially when there are competitions between a lot of multinational corporations. when we talk about oil and coal mining industry, we have BP oil, we have French oil, we also have like ExxonMobil, so we can pick and choose. There is going to be a tender process to ensure that we will not be cheated on. Especially this kind of raw material industry is really lucrative. This is an elastic market in which the corporations are going to be willing to give the best treatment because there is first mover advantage, because they don't want to lose out to their other competitors. So they will try to win the hearts and minds of the government and the people of this local population by either giving them adequate amount of salary, by giving them like the possibility of corporate social responsibility that is decent, or by giving them more projects like education, bridges, roads as a political transaction between this deal and the project itself. But I think yeah, in our side of the house, like these kind of projects are going to be like a really big issue in this particular state. It's going to be discussed in every election cycle. It's going to be discussed within political parties. There is going to be check and balance between media, individuals, and the corporation, as well as these politicians. So it's not going to be that bad. The next thing I want to explain is why this is likely that we could make products of value in our refinery. The first thing is we could incentivize the private investors to give education to the people to ensure smooth learning curve to which they could transition away from becoming hard blue-collar workforce into becoming white-collar workforce. Notice that the motion doesn't really necessarily want the government side of the house to do it like in the next 2 or 3 years. We are going to do it in a gradual process in which that this learning curve is going to be slow, but it's going to be sure. Like I'm sure, like in the next 20 and 30 years, when the education industry is already like strong enough, we could do this to the fullest extent. But we're going to do gradually. The difference is in the side of the house, we will not do this at all. But this is only happening in our side of the house because the educational investment will be a product of public-private partnership between government to give them a wake-up call to focus more on the educational sectors. And private corporations and shareholders would also have the incentive to give more scholarship and build up of educational infrastructures in these developing countries, which is only exclusive in OG, because that's the only way this company and private shareholders can make use of these raw materials and get them the profits as the shareholders, because they want to have the people to motorize and operationalize the investment project to which they are the shareholders in that particular company. That's the only way we incentivize government and private corporations to give more educational investment to these developing countries. So what are the benefits that will accrue with this transition away from blue collar to white collar jobs? Obviously, the first thing is we will have more jobs that like more expanded in terms of the definition, in terms of the number as well. It's not only the production in the factories or the coal mining industry that is hard labor in nature, but we are also going to expand in the finance branch, like the accountant, HR supervisors, legal defense, in marketing, sales, or customer services, in R&D, like in development and IT, which is extremely important for 3 reasons. The first is because there is possibility of automation, right? It's already existing in status quo right now. So we need to transition away from jobs that are easy to be automated into jobs that are harder to be automated, like jobs that require human-to-human interaction, like customer service and HR supervisors that can only exist when you don't only like try to mine nickel, but also make it into a product like stainless steel products or handphones or anything. So you can also marketize this product. So you need more workforce that are white collar in nature. The second thing why this is important is because the possibility of our resources will be plummeted in the future. And at that point that our resources already plummeted, we don't have any cushion on their side of the house to give people jobs, to make them have sustainable living, because the companies that they depend on already pull out from the state. But lastly, there is a possibility of the corporations find any other natural resources in other countries, to which when they do have this and they think that these other source of other chemicals in other countries are more lucrative, they can simply pull out and withdraw without any substantial cost. In our side of the house, when we have like this private corporations and private shareholders already have the branch and subsidiary companies in these particular developing countries, not only the excavation and the mining process, but also the accountant, the marketing, and the R&D, it will be significantly a larger cost for them to pull out that will create a more sustainable business model in our side of the house. Lastly, when we talk about developing countries, even we have the on that side of the house, even in the best case scenario that government can get money from the transaction and the trade of these raw materials, it means that the government is the one that have the capital. So government will allocate it in things like social subsidies or like giving cash handout to the people that will make the people dependent, because the one that controls this money is the government. And it means that the government will not have any multiplier effect, because people don't have like enough sustainable disposable income to be spent on other industries. In our side of the house, when the money is obtained by the people, not through the government social projects, but from the cash handouts of salary that they get from the corporations, it means that we are going to democratize the access of capital. There will be more domino effects of economic development, because when people now have disposable income from the white collar jobs that they have, they can spend more. There is going to be more circulation of money, circulation of capital, and will create more supply and demand in other parts of the industries like entertainment, e-commerce, and so on and so forth. That can only exist in our side of the house.
Okay, thank you, DPM. Now to close the case from opposition, I would like to invite DLO.
Hello. Audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Assalamualaikum. If you want to PY, just unmute yourself, yeah. That's okay. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, refineries is not the whole processes. It's just where you transform one raw material into industry usable material. That's the only thing that they're going to co-opt in this particular debate, right? It doesn't expand beyond that. It's not distribution. It's not creating, for example, another shell companies, for example, to create any further export and import, for example, right? No, it's not. It's just simply the difference that you're selling nickel and you're now selling processed nickel. That's all. So they don't have the whole fiat of saying there will be white collar jobs. No, it's not, right? Because that distribution is still the same, right? If we talk about distribution companies that already exist in status quo, I don't think the existence of local refiners will totally shift the landscape. It's just maybe shift the business model a bit from like they distributing it from exporting it from China and then selling it here. It's now they export it from let's say Mojokerto and selling it in Palembang, things like that lah. It doesn't really change a lot for the distributor part of it, right? So no job created. But secondly, I think it's a weird point about job opportunity also, because it's not job that are not vulnerable to automation. It is vulnerable to automation because it's manual labor jobs, right? We talk about refineries. It's people who are going to the factories, the refineries, basically. They go to enter this place and then they wear their hazard suit because it's very dangerous in there. They wear all this protective gear, and what they do is they move stuff. And these are not white collar jobs. This is blue collar jobs, and I don't think it's a very huge upgrade from the current extractive processes that we already have. So I think let's discredit all the kind of points that they brought about that. But I think the most important points of clarification that I also need to make here is that they never responded to our environmental impact that we already talked about, right? I think the key differences when we talk about refineries and extractions is that you create an additional layer. You co-op an additional layer of environmental impact that may happen inside our countries. What do I mean by this? Refineries involves a lot of use of chemical. When you want to process nickel into processed nickel, there needs to involve a chemical. So when you involve chemicals, what does this mean? This means that there needs to be a waste management system, right? But even a perfect waste management system needs to be disposed. To an extent, this processed waste also brings environmental damage to the river, for example, if you dispose it in a river, or to the sea. That if you're an oil company like BP who dispose it into the sea, there is a marginal environmental impact, even if the waste management system is already perfect. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a possible marginal environmental impact that we're co-opting here, that we're currently outsourcing that kind of risk to the other countries. And they never responded to these particular points that Oma brought. I think this is important. So what I'm going to extend this debate into, I'm going to talk about flexibility and then talk about economy, because a lot of their points talking about economy, multiplier effect with a lot of these economic jargons, but doesn't really know what are the creations of value that's involved within that. I think we need to talk about not economic growth, but rather the stability. Because what's important for developing countries is not that we want to co-opt as much as profit as possible, because that will also not happen on their side of the house, by the way, because they're co-opting foreign investors. That means that if the capital comes here and then they produce something with more value, this additional value goes back to the investors accumulated overseas in South Korea or America anyway. So there's no additional value that we're getting in our country. And therefore, we think what's important is not the additional value that we create, but the safety of this. It means that we are going to make sure that we're only making a low risk investment towards any production that we're doing in our country. Why this is not safe and why this is not flexible if you build refinery. Refinery means that you're forced to continue to produce a specific kind of products that meets a certain specification for a certain industries. So for example, if you're processing nickel for the use of cars, that or Tesla, for example, that will be different compared to you processing nickel to create terminal Kuningan. Right? It's totally different. If you're producing oil, for example, if you want to meet specification of a certain products or certain market, you need to process the oil to be 95, for example. You cannot process it like Pertamina Dexlite or Pertamina Premium, for example. That's very cheap, that's suitable to our market. Why this flexibility of refineries is going to be impacted on your side of the house? One, if you build a refineries in our fields, that means that our investment, what we are producing here actually, and our focus, by the way, is also going to be focused on creating facilities that is refining a specific products that meets that specific requirement. For example, is Tesla, we only create Tesla batteries. The second reason why it means that you always have to produce this is also because of conflict of interest between investors. Because when you invite foreign investors to come to our country and build refineries, meaning that refineries will meet the specification of what they are actually looking for. For example, if their oil company, if their oil refinery that comes from United States of America or Europe, the kind of oils that you're going to refine and they're going to produce from that refineries is the one that met their specification. This is a conflict of interest that happens when you bring in foreign investors. Why it is dangerous is because of two reasons. The first reason is that it might not be useful for our countries because it's not a specification that might be useful for our countries at the end of the day. So all their arguments about accessibility might not be work because it's mismatched. But this is not a very huge harm. The very huge harm is this, because already invest a lot of our resources and people already working in there, but the market fluctuates. For example, there will be less demand to the specific refined oils. There will be less demand to the specific refined nickel or the specific batteries for Tesla. Let's say the market fluctuates and we already set up a lot of things, for example, to support this because of the initial conflict of investors. Who will face the consequences? One is our country, because they already built a lot of this. We already facilitate them building roads, building bridges for the sake of this proceeding as what they want. We want to smoothen the deal, for example. But then all of this useless because the market fluctuates. But secondly, the people who got the jobs there, it means they're already working at the labor. They're working specifically trained towards that. And then now they're going to get laid off and they will lose their jobs. This means it's less flexible, right? When we come to export our raw materials, the demands are typically stable. This is not a time where people don't need nickel, don't need oil. We just outsource the risk to other countries. That's the easiest thing that we could do as a developing countries, and we think we need that to stabilize who back to propose.
Thank you, Diallo. To start the second half of the debate, I would like to invite government member.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So if everyone's ready, I will start my speech. Yeah, okay. We are the only house that prioritizes the vulnerable actors within this debate. Unlike the opening government, We will mechanize all our arguments. We aim to claim why it is likely to have jobs on our side of the house, why there is an empowerment of SMEs on our side of the house. And by prioritizing the most helpless individuals, we win this debate. There are two main issues that I would like to bring up. First, how we develop an economy and transfer of knowledge on our side of the house. And secondly, why we are the house that best protects the vulnerable actors. First, I would like to start by clarifying something that the opening opposition said. The opening opposition said that there would be an environmental impact on our side of the house, but taking raw materials exclusively also has an environmental impact. 3 examples for this. First, land goes down because of mining. This is a huge economic impact that mining has. Secondly, palm forests are cut down every single day for palm oil. And thirdly, mining makes a dirty water supply. So if you claim that the environmental impact is worse on our side of the house, it does not make sense because the environmental impacts are just as stringent on yours. So first, how we develop the economy and the transfer of knowledge on our side. The opposition has claimed that the economy doesn't develop because it is costly and the knowledge doesn't exist because we're outcompeted by developed countries. This is not true. To prove this, let's break this down into 2 parts. First, the development of economy. Three layers to this. If the concern is a high cost, we can solve this. Our side has better costs, actually. First, because we have a local workforce. Secondly, we have local technology. But most importantly, because we have much less transportation costs. Think about it this way. We don't have to spend thousands of dollars shipping the raw materials from different parts of the world. The less transportation cost proves that we have a much better cost on our side of the house. Secondly, the cost is actually more expensive on your side of the house because operation cost to take raw materials is inherently expensive. There are things like this. First, the safety of workers. The workers' safety is super important on your side of the house, and that is something that is super expensive to develop. Secondly, insurance for later. Secondly, insurance within your side of the house. And third, maintenance. And most importantly, the return on your side for just raw materials is much less. The price of coal or the price of palm oil is super cheap. So the cost is not discovered on your side of the house. Comparatively on our side of the house, even if it is expensive, it's okay because there's an income from products selling at a higher price than our raw materials. So cost is worse ultimately on your side of the house. Secondly, the issue of knowledge. The reasons as to why we are incapable is because there's no investment in the path of knowledge sharing in the first place. So we're not outcompeted. Developed countries' products are literally reliant on developing countries' raw materials. So the stopping of supply means either that A, their prices would be higher so we can compete and this forces a transfer of knowledge, or B, they're out of the market completely, so then we control the market. Ultimately though, because the developed countries are so reliant on our raw materials and our supply chain, then we would win on this contention. So secondly, how we are the house that best protects the vulnerable actors and are the only house that does so. This is the main difference between our case with the opening government, and there are 3 reasons for this. First is because we help the local economy. By focusing on this action, we are investing in local companies and SMEs in the area. Think about coal mines in Kalimantan or gold mines in Papua. Most likely, we would invest in local refineries. Why is this likely? First, because transport costs. Making products is hard, and we need a structure to find the cheapest alternative for the cheapest cheapest products. To utilize the local economy, it is most likely to have a cheap transport. Secondly, because of local knowledge. Local villages that are closest to mines or forests or any sort of raw material source are the ones who best know what kind of products we can make. In the status quo, they refine these products already, albeit in a smaller sort of scale. Think of villagers that make rotan bags or make products from the raw materials that they find. They know these areas, therefore they will be asked to help with this refinery. So who do we benefit on our side of the house? People in rural areas, and this creates more job absorption because we increase SMEs. The opening opposition said refineries don't take a full product, only a processed product. Exactly because of this is why SMEs then get cheap products. That makes SMEs get cheaper local usable products. Therefore, on our side of the house, SMEs and locals are advantaged. Secondly, we attract investment. And why is this likely? First, because this is a lucrative and untapped market. Take a look back on all the old lucrative and untapped markets in history, for example. The oil refinery business started in 1860 with John D. Rockefeller, and this became extremely lucrative fast with his creation of Standard Oil. This repeated with Bill Gates and the technological boom. People know this, and they will be interested in investing in a market that is completely new and untapped and has potential to boom. Then there would be financial help that will make us more likely to get A, technology, and B, transfer of knowledge or training. Secondly, let's say that maybe there might not be an untapped market because products may be the same, but let's engage in a scenario where there is a big manufacturer that refines things. In a situation like this, even if we don't have the new untapped market, we are still likely to have a transfer of knowledge. Two reasons for this. A, when we stop exporting raw materials, developed countries have an incentive structure to find a new way to try and work with the developing countries because, again, they're reliant on our raw materials. They need our raw materials for machineries or for steam, either because they have geographic localities in developing countries that are exclusive, but most likely this will establish cooperation in other means. It might not be the same way that is happening currently, but it would still be cooperation. Now, currently in the status quo, how they manipulate you is that you export the product, you export the raw materials, and then they make the product, and the developing countries can enjoy these products. But we wish to shift that power dynamic. We want developing countries to get a profit. The cooperation in this sort of debate would end up being like they give us the technology to refine these products, and then we give them a 20% profit, or any sort of things like that. But whatever it is, it would result in better teamwork. It would result in a shift in the power dynamic, because it's not only one to control the prices, but second, we get an influx of knowledge and technology. So even if investment doesn't come, the situation in the status quo can be modified in our favor. And this would be used to enlarge refineries and have more people to hire, or to even diversify the market to create a more stable market. So comparatively, on the opposition side of the house, there is no job absorption. The mining industry that just takes away raw materials does not create any sort of meaningful job absorption. This is worse, even if we have the same amount of raw material refinery on both sides of the house. Why? Because simply of the quality of jobs. The opening government tried to bring this up, but failed to mechanize this issue. On the opposition side of the house, they just need raw materials. It's just raw materials and manual labor. For us, on the other hand, there is an incentive structure for necessary human resources to refine raw materials, and therefore the job quality will be better. For these reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank you, government member. To open the case from closing opposition, I invite the opposition member.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Can I please just have like 2 minutes because I need to go to the toilet? Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Starting. So, in the years following the Second World War, the developed countries reduced the tariffs in the framework of successive rounds of trade negotiations on an item-by-item basis. The negotiations involved a compromisation between the principles of reciprocity and of non-discrimination, with the developing countries offering few tariff concessions. The developed countries exchanged such concessions on products that interested these developed nations, right? Within the developing countries, nevertheless, benefited from the tariffs itself, the tariff reduction that was made under the most favored nation clause. Furthermore, although the extent of the tariff escalation has been reduced, processing activities in the developing countries continue to suffer discrimination as tariffs are generally nil on unprocessed goods, but rise of degree of fabrication on the processed goods. Since the effective rate of the tariff on the
Hello,
output exceeds the nominal
sorry,
rate
op
whenever
member.
the latter is higher than the tariff itself.
Op member. Yeah, your voice
Sorry?
is quite
Am I
distant.
still
Can
audible?
your voice? Yes, but your voice is quite distant. Can you like come closer to the mic or something? My timer stops at 44 seconds. Can you start
Hey,
from
sorry.
there? Yeah, this is much better.
Yeah, sorry.
Detik 44 ya.
Yep.
Yeah, you can start.
Yeah. So was it 45 seconds? Sorry?
45.
Okay. Restarting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Furthermore, although the extent of tariff escalation has been reduced, processing activities in the developing countries continue to suffer discrimination as tariffs are generally nil on processed goods, but the rise of the degree of fabrication of processed goods since the effective rate of the tariff on the output exceeds the nominal rate whenever the latter is higher than the tariff on the inputs itself. Relatively low input tariffs may give the high rise to give effective rates of the protection of the processing activity. For many developing economies, their main comparative advantage will be in producing primary products such as the raw material itself. The industry becomes an important source of economic growth, employment tax revenue, and also the export earning itself. Without primary products, countries would be worse off. I think that how the primary products industries can be stepping stone towards the economic development if export earnings are invested in improving different aspects of economic infrastructure. Primary products have, for example, raw materials and resources used in the productive process. Example include metals, agriculture, and products and minerals would likely to be better on the side of the opposition itself. So what is the differentiation between us and the OO? Within the under our side, we will have our contribution by actually explaining to you the more specific benefit and also the feasibility of the actual case of our case would likely to be happen, right? But before I move on, I want to question the OG itself, how all of a sudden under their side, the interest of the company and investors would likely to still be exist, right? Whether they still want the outcome of this refinery in the developing nations, because notice on how we think that the interest of this developed nations is how they also have the alternative to have their own products. For example, how US, for example, can produce their own cars without having the import from these developing nations by having their refinery at the very first place. We think that comparatively, we think that the interest of these developed nations is to gain this kind of raw material, and then they want to have this kind of process, right? And the only way is to be able to fulfill this kind of interest so that we can actually also have this economic growth is by having your raw material so that you can actually invest through our raw material and export it to the country that is actually already developed, right? But before I move on, let me just give you one response again for the OG itself. They're talking about how the utility itself, by having the raw materials, the purity can be controlled by the company. For example, aluminum purities. We think that how the purity itself is different on the usage itself. For example, how coal purity depends on the usage itself. The problem is that the equipment to purify this material is very expensive at the first place. Means that how the people that is in developing countries cannot make everything, and you must choose what kind of item you want to use at the first place. For example, how you can create the high quality coal versus the low quality coal, for example, to determine the purity, which can make it will be very much costly for us to be able to develop these kind of things as the developing nations. Because we think that exactly that the developing nations doesn't have the big capital to do to and have this kind of machinery in the to have this kind of purity, for example. We think that how the feasibility wouldn't likely to be exist under the side of the OG. But comparatively, when we have the actual materials and human resources, for example, to directly harvest this kind of raw material and cheaply also have this kind of beneficial that is directly to the nation's economy, how the price of the raw material is also clear and not getting dictated by certain company on the purity itself. We think that it can actually give a boost better to our economy because it can create the direct impact itself. But one response for the CG itself, what I don't get for the CG is how all of a a sudden this SME and also the people that are poor can have the accessibility on this refinery, because we think that exactly that they don't even have a technology, for example, to improving their kind of, for example, crops, for example, then all of a sudden they can have this accessibility on these refinery items, for example, because we think that this refinery items is very much expensive, and also you need to have, for example, qualifications to be in the job opportunities itself. Therefore, their job opportunities wouldn't likely to exist under the side of the OG, under the side of CG, sorry. Because how the segmentation of the work is already different. For example, how in the refinery you have to have the ability to work to actually have to produce the purity, for example. But moreover, how the cost of the material would like to, they mention on how the cost of the material would likely to be lower without the refinery itself, but they never explain to us why there will be the feasibility for us to dictate the price and have the interest for the other nations itself by having this refinery under our countries, right? We think that exactly that the developed nations are actually depending on developing nations to have this to affect their supply chains. Is the moment that we can still contribute on this now on the international economy by having our raw materials and also to contribute inside of the economy itself. Therefore, how we can actually have this kind of engagement with the international, it means that they still depend on us and have our economy itself. So let's move on to my substantive. First, I want to prove to you what would happen when they do this refinery. We think that how there are many laborers that are working in the mining that have the job opportunities itself. We think that the characteristic of the developing nation is that they have the workers that have the specific area that is very much easy and doesn't need lots of ability, for example, the mining area. We think that how by having the refinery itself means that there will be more likely of the facility to get these resources, which means that these technologies would have the different segmentation of the workers itself, which means that these workers that are working in the mining itself have the likelihood of how they tend to lose their job because it is actually getting replaced by the company and the people that is actually capable with this job, right? But even if they want to say that, oh, hey, miners can still work with the company, we think that it is not feasible. Two reasons. First, we think that how there's a different ability itself, a company itself we have to have the ability to work in the industrial tech. Meanwhile, the miner itself doesn't have this kind of ability to work in such technologies. They only have the ability to mine, for example. But secondly, in terms of the interest itself, we think that how the miners itself, the people itself have the interest to wanting to use their job because they like usually doing physical stuff that is according to their job, right? Therefore, this the feasibility wouldn't likely to be exist under their side of the house. But secondly, talking about how the developing resources of the developing countries have lots of resources, right? For example, nickel, coal, and etc. How we only harvest, for example, 40% of the resources. Meanwhile, the expectation of the other countries, how we can actually harvest is still high. With the question becomes, is it actually strategic to actually have this kind of refinery at the first place? Because we think that even in the developing countries, they have the low study, for example, in metallurgy, how the raw material is out. They don't have the understanding on how to do this kind of thing by having this kind of refinery itself, right? Because how we think that the interest of the developing nations is how they actually have this kind of refinery to invest on these developing nations. But we think that because of the segmentation itself would likely to be bad. But what would likely to be worse under their side? First, it can create, when we have this refinery, it can create more competition between the developing nations and the developed nations, because this competition itself can create the worst condition, because how the developed nations already have the bigger capital and also they have the bigger market in the world. Therefore, when we actually have certain product by this refinery, it would actually be counted, for example. Therefore, this benefit would outweigh the harm that exists under our side. Therefore, proud to post. Thank you.
Thank you, opposition member. Now, I'd like to hear the final statements from government bench. I'd like to invite the government witness.
Test, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to engage to OO's environmental impact. Second, I'm going to engage the economic betterment, entirely engaging to the opposition bench, right? So about environment. So basically what we've proven to you on our side of the house is that it's symmetrical, right? Sofia has proven to you clearly that things like raw material extortion also causes environmental impact. Things like how then there's prone to landslide, things like how then you corrupt water and those kind of things. So it means that the harm is symmetrical. I don't think you should count this particular argumentation. But it's even worse on their side of the house. Understand that if you're focusing on raw materials, there's no possible way for you to change it to be more environmental friendly, because there's only one way for you to take raw materials. It's to mine, it's to take down trees and plant palm trees and whatsoever. So that's the only way. So therefore, the harm is constant on their side of the house. So what makes it asymmetrical is that on our side of the house, throughout time, researches researches on how then you refine these particular materials, researches how then you limit and reduce waste exists on our side house, because the method to refine these particular materials varied, and you could make it more environmental friendly. So that's to say that even if the harm is symmetrical, it becomes asymmetrical because on our side house we have mitigating factor, and we could minimize the harm over time. So in terms of environmental damage, even if it's just one liner point, in case you count this as a tipping point, CG wins. Second of all, the biggest issue of all, right? Talking about economic betterment and whatnot. Basically, what OO and CO wanted to have is that, oh, we don't have the capability and feasibility to do so. Second, they posit about the idea of how then the current situation of pandering or developing countries, like, giving investment because they're depending on you, are a better situation for this developing country. So two things. First time we talk about investment, right? So why then on our side of the house, we have more investment and we can secure money and capital to reduce costs and to overcome the adversity of lack of technology and those kind of things. Unlike OG, we're not going to argue about first mover advantage, because I don't necessarily understand why first mover advantage applies on this, because the political reality is the developing countries that invest on us runs on the same market as we do. So therefore, the investment on that are less likely. But we're going to argue something that's more structure inherent. This is why what Sofia did is something that's very important, right? She posed that right now, the context of cooperation between developing countries and developed countries are based on manipulation. They manipulate these developing countries to keep supplying them raw materials, and they would sell them like a real product in their country, in these developing countries, with a higher prices. This cycle is a never-ending cycle because there's a manipulation to halt technology. There's a manipulation to halt transfer of knowledge and training of human capital and whatnot. This engages why the dependency of developed countries is bad in closing opposition, because we never know, because we are going to stuck with being developing countries and becoming a mine for them to gain profit. We don't want that. But what changes on our side house? What shifts is that the power dynamics. We're going to change the cooperation system. We're not saying that these people will eventually be nice to us, but there is a pragmatic interest why then they would want to do so, because understand their products is literally relying on the raw materials. Stopping exports means that, number one, either their cost of the product will be higher, so therefore the profit will be reduced, or second of all, they're out of the market entirely. This cost exactly incentivizes them to find another way of cooperation that we can control. What kind of cooperation that exists on our side house? The cooperation for them to invest in technology, for instance, for these refineries, but at the same time, they gain profit from it. This type of cooperations are likely because what they seek for is profit. Losing profit and having lesser profit as a comparative, obviously they would have like a lesser comparative on our side house. So therefore, it is likely not only maintaining investment and having more money, but it's more likely for us to have technological transfer and the ability and feasibility for us to do so. This is important because number one, it engaged with idea of OO's cost. How then they say that this is costly and whatsoever. We cannot do this. We said that we have secure funding on which that we're going to reduce the cost eventually. And second of all, we're better than OG in this because we mechanize. How then you secure private investors? How then you would have investment by this method? This mechanization is the only way for you to be able to materialize OG's argumentation about investment. So we tag that contribution. But lastly, this is important because CEO's concern about like feasibility and whatsoever has been answered, right? Because their concern is literally talking about technology and the ability of this developed country to do so. We've proven to you why the technology exists. We've proven to you why money exists, and we secure that we say their claim is invalid. But second of all, let's talk about the idea of empowering SMEs, right? The only response from CG is to say that we don't understand how. Literally, my member tell you the process, how that you empower SMEs. But I'm going to reiterate, right? But the difference is, OG did a good job. Like saying that, oh, we're going to establish job absorption and whatsoever. But then never did they prove how then you would be able to do this. This is why CG is really important, because we're going to mechanize this effort. What we're going to have on our side house? Number one, SMEs will be bigger because there will be an incentive structure for this reinvestment money for exports to refineries and goes to this local corporation whatsoever. Not only Sofia have proven to you because of the cheaper prices, locality knows the product better and whatsoever, but also because they have the capacity to do so. Unlike what CEO claimed that these people don't know shit, we said that they know shit, right? Because most of the time, local corporation and domestic market there are using these raw materials to create products themselves. It might not be an advanced product, but they have the knowledge of this particular raw materials to begin with. This is exactly why they becoming a lucrative investment for the government to do so. Therefore, they would have more money. Therefore, they could enlarge SMEs and their corporation whatsoever, absorb paying job in the process. This is the process that OG is missing. But the second thing that we say, well, then it will empower SMEs. It's because that, exactly, if Rizqi is trying to say that refineries is not creating final products, it's only creating a process products, that's fine. Because this SME needs this processed product that is cheaper, resulted from a local refineries, right? Because the reason as to why they are competed by MNC, because MNCs got these raw materials and that sell it with a higher price and with more stable quality of product. Because these SMEs cannot access this, because most probably you wouldn't sell these raw materials to this particular individual. But when you are processing it and you have this local supply chain for them, it's easier for them to have quality products, better accessibility, and those kind of things. Eventually, this profit will lead to what? Job absorption. We're going to literally make these people have more quality of jobs and whatsoever. But unlike OG, we're not going to say that they are prone to automation, right? Because OO's response to that is correct. But we're going to say is that the quality of job it will have. Because we're not saying that they will change to managerial job, but what we're saying that they will have career path. This specialization will make this specialty and skills will make them easier to compete to other jobs outside. This is exactly why the output of this will be three things. Number one, reducing inequality. This rural area individual would most probably have the capacity and skill to compete with urban area individual. But second of all, it also reduces the equality of development because we're going to increase their purchasing power having a running economy. This is exactly why development of developing countries in this economic model will be more proliferated to the outer and outskirts of places and whatsoever. This is a benefit that is important because understanding developing countries, rural to urban ratio are so asymmetrical. We say this is a more important benefit. We're very proud to.
Thank you, Government Whip. To end the debate, I would like to hear from Opposition Whip.
Am I audible?
Yes.
All right. Wait. Let me set up my timer. Aduh. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. As a mining student, profit from raw material is already massive, especially in Indonesia and developing country, for instance. Like income for raw material for Indonesia is literally 8 trillion per year. They're literally also creating a huge amount of lessen gap that exists coming from the low and higher income society, for instance, or something like that. I will contextualize the debate by talking about two things. What is the cost of demand that coming from side government? And secondly, what is the cost of having this kind of thing without the extent of FDI? With that in mind, firstly, talking about FDI, why it is more unlikely to be happen inside government. Firstly, let's take a look what is their idea. Their idea is that, oh yeah, this kind of corporation will come because they rely on developing country in raw material. Not that what happened in status quo is that export in the status quo is literally something that you send is in a very massive amount of time, in a very massive amount of, heaviness, for instances, like you send like 10 ton of nickel, for instance, for this kind of corporation, so they're able to process it by also saving this kind of raw material because they want to create this kind of future market concept where they think that, oh yeah, if in the future the price is actually fluid, for instance, or fluctuative, for instance, I will save several of it to ensure for my productivity like for 5 or 10 years in the future, for instances. This is why what happened in developed country recently. Developed country recently tried to research on recycle method of using the unused Tesla battery, for instances, to eventually create another type of nickel that able to create also battery of Tesla. The reason why this is actually being dropped because the cost of it compared to import is actually very massive different, right? What will happen is that the cost of foreign direct investment by this kind of corporation will be much more higher compared to the cost of this kind of corporation to actually continue this kind of research, because this research literally already almost done and only like 1 or 2 years expense toward them actually completing this kind of research, right? What does it mean? It means that this kind of foreign direct investment or corporation will not likely to just direct investing in your world, but rather they just shift it to another thing like recycle material, for instances, that equally also effective at the end of the day, right? What does it mean? It means that directly it's clashing with the idea of foreign direct investment, because they cannot just say that, oh yeah, they will invest because they will rely on us on raw material, but they need to explain the structural reason why it is much more less costly compared to this, right? They never actually explain. But secondly, let's talk about price of let's talk about the local empowerment SMEs that they want to talk about, right? This is very unrealistic, right? Why? Two things. Number one is that most of the time this kind of local people, like local corporation, literally doesn't know what does it use to actually develop this kind of raw material like iron, for instances, or something like that. Literally mining just started in 1994, and no one literally know how to massive mining is actually started in 1994, and no one know how to actually use and puring this kind of material, right? The only thing that they're able to do is only creating this kind of kapak zaman batu, right? That literally don't have cost, don't have actually value to actually being exported, for instance, or something like that. This means that this kind of local corporation also literally does not know what does it need to actually create a very good product, for instance, that worthy for export, for instance. Most likely that we will have, like what they say, only tabarotan, for instances, that only empowering in a local market, for instance, but never actually getting a huge amount of economical income that exists in their world. So what is the cost that closing opposition want to talk about and mechanize, right? Opening opposition have this kind of idea, but closing opposition is the one that's actually mechanized, right? How current industry actually work? The export of raw material is in a diverse amount of industry, right? You sold nickel to all like US and EU machinery industry, right? For them, it is not very costly for them to do this kind of refinery because they process this kind of refinery further, also creating this kind of battery for nickel, for instance, battery for Tesla, for instances, and also utilize it for other things, like utilizing the same amount, like the same purity of this kind of nickel for creating another thing that they need, for instances. The problem with it is that how you created this kind of amount of purity is very diverse for one or another. You need to actually create a different amount of hydrometallurgy, for instances, or something like Ominusi, for instances, that literally differs from one type of raw material to another type of material. What does it mean? It means that if you want to pander for a lot of income, for instances, you need to create a lot of infrastructure that able to create this kind of thing, which is inherently costly. Literally, Indonesia does not really have this kind of amount of pyrometallurgy factory, for instances, because it is costly if they created it here, and they only created it in a foreign country like US or EU, for instances, because it is not costly compared to if they only created in Indonesia, for instances. If we talk about whether or not Indonesia or developing country able to create this kind of whether or not this kind of country have the knowledge to do this kind of refinery, they do. But the problem is that the cost is so much bigger compared to you only selling this kind of product in a foreign country, for instances, or something like that. The very good study case for this is that combination of iron, literally using water and acid pump, for instances, that cost you like $1 million to actually creating this kind of factory, for instance. Compared to nickel use electricity conducting hydrometallurgy, for instances, that literally having different amount of this, right? And the amount of purity is also dependent also to what kind of acid that you use in this kind of community or purement, for instances. What does it mean? It means that you will make a tons of cost to go to this kind of diverse amount of industry. The problem is that this kind of diverse amount of industry does not need like 1 ton of iron, for instances. Most of the time, they only need like 500 kilogram or 100 kilogram of nickel of 80%, for instances, so on and so forth. But while the effective or efficient number of refinery to get a BEP, for instances, it's on the level that is much more higher, like 1 ton or 2 tons, for instances, or something like that. What does it mean inherently? Inherently is that the cost of you trying to make this kind of refinery by your own self, like your own country, is something that inherently costly and something that will not get that by this kind of foreign direct investment, because foreign direct investment also see this as costly compared to recycle method that they actually already researched, right? Talking about job vacancy and job opportunity, right? The question is that will the job opportunity is something that is pandering to like local labor, for example, or something like that? Most of the time, no. Why this kind of corporation, even if FDI happen, have the incentive to just hire the local people, like local scientists, for instances? They probably already have a lot of scientists in Germany, for instances, that they just can brought to Indonesia, for instance, and say that, oh yeah, just do this kind of things, on and so forth. And most of the time, it's white collar worker. If you need someone that move this kind of iron material, for example, you can just take it from the same worker that actually doing this kind of exploration from mining, for instances, or something like that. Meaning that the job opportunity is something that's non-existent as well. But what is the most important thing that closing opposition will triumph over any other benches? Firstly, is that foreign direct investment is something that's unlikely to happen due to the cost of this kind of corporation that actually exists. Assuming that FDI also happen, we think also it's also equally bad. Why? Two things. Number one is that manipulation for developing country will also still be there, like what opening debate is actually talking about. Why the incentive is actually there? Simple, because you don't have the incentive to just making your competitors actually far more, smarter, for instances. Most likely what will happen is that you just come and say that, oh yeah, just do whatever our worker taught you to do so, right? What does it mean? What it means to happen is that this just replacement of a more labor worker, for instances, and that be taken from maybe this kind of exploration corporation, for instances, or something like that, in which means that if the case about automation does happen, this certain thing just create a zero-sum game without any benefit whatsoever. What is the exclusive benefit coming from closing opposition? It's two metrics. Number one, when foreign direct investment is not actually coming, it is very costly in journey for you to invest more on this kind of refinery. It is much more better to just rely on the current export that literally already giving you a lot of income, for instances. For those reasons, we proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you, Opweb. Thanks everyone for the